HOA Karen called cops as I returned early to my mansion. She's been living there for 2 weeks. I had been away for a few days on a business trip. The trip was supposed to last a week, but due to a few sudden changes in my schedule, I found myself returning home earlier than expected. I wasn't looking forward to the long drive, but I was relieved to be back at the mansion. It was quiet, peaceful, and I had missed the comfort of my own space. The drive was smooth, the weather was perfect, and I couldn't help but smile as I approached the familiar gates of my home. As I turned onto the long driveway, I noticed something odd. There was a car parked in front of the house. It wasn't my usual car, nor was it anyone I recognized. My first thought was that a neighbor had parked there, maybe someone who had come to visit, but something about the car seemed out of place. It was parked too close to the entrance, and it seemed like it had been left there for a while. I slowed the car down, my curiosity growing. I couldn't help but wonder who would be at my house without my permission. I parked my car, still staring at the strange vehicle in confusion. As I stepped out of the car, I felt a strange tension in the air. The house looked the same, but the feeling was different. There was an eerie silence that I couldn't explain. Maybe I was just tired from the drive, but something didn't feel right. I walked toward the front door, my footsteps echoing on the stone path. When I reached the door, I noticed it was unlocked. I frowned. This wasn't normal. I always made sure the door was locked before I left. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling in my stomach as I slowly pushed the door open. To my surprise, the house was quiet, but I could hear faint noises coming from the living room. It was a soft murmur, like someone talking. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I had left something on or if I was hearing things. But as I stepped further into the foyer, I saw her. There was a woman sitting comfortably on one of the couches in the living room. She looked completely at ease, almost as if she had been living there for weeks. Her presence was so unexpected that I froze for a moment, trying to process what was happening. She was in her mid-30s, wearing a casual dress, and she had her feet up on the coffee table. She didn't seem startled or surprised to see me. In fact, she didn't even look up as I walked into the room. "Excuse me, who are you?" I finally asked, my voice a little shaky. I had no idea who this person was, and I certainly wasn't used to strangers being in my house without my permission. She slowly turned her head and looked at me, her expression calm but unreadable. "Oh, you're home early," she said nonchalantly. "I wasn't expecting you back for a few more days." I stood there, dumbfounded. "Who are you?" I repeated, my voice a little firmer this time. "What are you doing here?" She smiled, clearly not understanding the shock on my face. "I'm just staying here for a bit," she explained casually. "I'm renting the place. The HOA—" "Wait, what?" I interrupted, feeling my heart race. "The HOA? I didn't rent out my house to anyone. Are you saying the homeowners association sent you?" The woman nodded as if what she was saying was completely normal. "Yes, I'm staying here for a short time. The association arranged it." I blinked in disbelief. I knew for a fact that I hadn't rented out the house. I didn't even know the homeowners association was involved in any kind of rental agreements for private properties. My mind was racing as I tried to make sense of this strange situation. I had no idea who this woman was, nor did I have any recollection of agreeing to rent out my mansion. "Are you sure you're in the right house?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know who you are, and I don't know anything about this arrangement." The woman seemed unbothered by my confusion. "Oh, I'm sure. I've been staying here for 2 weeks now," she said, her tone almost matter-of-fact. "Everything's been arranged with the HOA." This was getting stranger by the second. I had been away for several days, but I knew for a fact that I hadn't authorized any kind of agreement with anyone. And the fact that she had been living here for 2 weeks, without my permission, was beyond unsettling. I felt a cold wave of anger rising in me. How could someone just move into my home without my knowledge? "Listen," I said, my voice growing more forceful. "You need to leave. I don't know who you are, but you have no right to be here. This is my house." The woman didn't budge. In fact, she didn't seem fazed at all by my demand. "I'm sorry, but the HOA said I could stay here. I'm just following their instructions." I could feel the tension building between us. I had no idea who this woman was or how she had gotten into my house, but there was no way I was going to let her stay any longer. My frustration was starting to bubble over. "I don't care what the HOA told you," I said firmly. "You're trespassing and you need to leave immediately." She finally looked up at me, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she were calculating something. You're not going to make me leave, are you? The HOA is going to back me up. Something about her confidence made me uneasy. How could she be so sure? And why wasn't she showing any signs of fear or hesitation? The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like she had been expecting a confrontation like this. I'm calling the police, I said, taking out my phone. There was no way I was going to let this stranger continue to live in my house. I was starting to feel like I had walked into some kind of trap. She smirked at me, as if my call to the authorities didn't faze her in the slightest. Go ahead, she said. You're not going to win this one. I stared at her for a moment, unsure of what else to do. Was she really going to stand there and act like everything was fine? My hands trembled slightly as I dialed the number for the police, my mind still racing. This was not how I had imagined coming home. The phone rang in my ear as I stood there, staring at the woman. She didn't move an inch, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I was about to confront someone who had invaded my personal space, and I had no idea how things were going to unfold. As the phone rang in my ear, I felt my frustration growing. The woman on the couch sat there with a strange sense of calm, as if this was just another day for her. Every part of me wanted to kick her out of my house right there and then, but I knew I had to handle this carefully. She had already made it clear that she was confident in her position, and I needed to be sure about what I was dealing with before the situation escalated further. The phone rang 3 times before someone picked up. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice came through, cool and professional. I have a woman in my house who says she's renting it, I started, trying to keep my voice steady. I never rented it out to anyone, and I just got home to find her living here. She's been here for 2 weeks without my permission. The operator asked a few more questions, confirming the address and the situation. Stay on the line. Officers are on their way, they said before hanging up. I glanced at the woman again. She was still sitting there as if she had all the time in the world. Her eyes met mine, and she smiled almost smugly. You really think calling the cops is going to solve anything? She said, her voice calm and almost condescending. The HOA has already arranged everything. You can't just kick me out. I could feel my blood pressure rising. This is my house, I said, my voice firmer now. You have no right to be here. No matter what you say, I never gave anyone permission to rent out my home. She didn't seem to react to my words. Instead, she leaned back further into the couch, crossing her arms in a way that suggested she wasn't going anywhere. The HOA handles all of that, she replied, her voice filled with an almost bored tone. You must have missed the notice. I'm just here because they said I could be. The more she spoke, the more I felt like I was getting tangled in a web of lies. My mind raced as I tried to understand how something like this could happen. The HOA was supposed to help maintain the community, not make decisions like this without informing the homeowners. It didn't make sense. There had to be something more to this story. You expect me to believe that? I asked, my disbelief evident in my tone. I've been living here for years and I've never heard of anything like this. I'm the one who decides who stays in my house. She simply shrugged, unfazed. Well, you're back now and the arrangement has already been made. I'm sure the HOA will back me up when the cops arrive. Her arrogance was starting to grate on my nerves. It felt like she was challenging me, daring me to do something about it. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. The last thing I wanted was to get into a shouting match with someone who was clearly just trying to get under my skin. I turned away from her for a moment, walking toward the window. I could see the police car approaching from a distance, its lights flashing in the stillness of the evening. I felt a strange sense of relief, knowing that help was on the way, but I also knew that this wasn't going to be as simple as just getting rid of her. There was a lot more to this situation than I had initially realized. As I stood there by the window, I couldn't help but think about how absurd all of this was. How could someone just walk into your life and take over your home without your consent? The more I thought about it, the more it felt like a violation. This wasn't just about a stranger staying in my house. This was about someone trying to control my life, my space, and my home. I wasn't going to let that happen. I turned back to face her. You're not welcome here, I said, trying to remain composed. I don't care what the HOA told you. You need to leave now. She just shook her head, her smirk never faltering. I don't think you're in a position to be making demands, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. I'm already here and I've got all the papers to prove it. When the cops get here, they'll tell you the same thing. I wasn't about to back down, but the more she spoke, the more I felt like I was losing control of the situation. She wasn't behaving like someone who was scared or confused. She was acting like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. That made me more wary than I'd ever been. I couldn't let her manipulate me into backing off, but I also had to be careful. I didn't know what kind of person I was dealing with. I moved back toward the door, my eyes flicking to the front window again. The police car was getting closer now. The flashing lights cast an eerie glow across the front yard, and I could feel my anxiety rising. This was no longer just an issue of someone trespassing. It was turning into something much bigger. What if this woman wasn't just some random person? What if she was involved in something more sinister? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on here than met the eye. The doorbell rang, followed by a knock at the door. I quickly walked over and opened it. Two police officers stood outside, their expressions professional and serious. "I'm glad you called us," one of the officers said, stepping inside. "What's going on here?" I quickly explained the situation, telling them about the woman's claim that she had been renting the house through the HOA. I could tell they were skeptical, but they listened as I described everything that had happened so far. The woman, who had been sitting quietly up until now, stood up as they entered the room. "I'm just staying here temporarily," she said, her voice calm and steady. "The HOA arranged it. I have the paperwork to prove it." The officer glanced at me, then back at her. "Can we see those papers?" he asked. The woman handed over the documents without hesitation, but I could see a flicker of doubt in the officer's eyes as he examined them. I wasn't sure if he was just being cautious or if he had already picked up on something suspicious, but the way he scrutinized the papers made me think that maybe this wasn't as clear-cut as the woman was making it out to be. "I don't think these are legitimate," the officer said after a moment of silence. "We're going to need to take a closer look at this. Stay here." The woman's confident expression faltered for a split second, and I could see her clenching her fists at her sides. She was starting to lose her cool, but she quickly regained her composure. "You're making a mistake," she said, but there was an edge to her voice now, a tone of desperation that hadn't been there before. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time in the past few hours, I felt like I was starting to get a handle on the situation. The officers were beginning to see through her story, and that gave me hope. This wasn't going to be easy, but I wasn't about to let someone take control of my life, my home, without a fight. The officer stood there, carefully examining the documents the woman had handed him. The silence in the room felt heavy, and I could feel my heart racing as I watched them go over the papers. I had no idea what to expect, but I was starting to feel a mix of confusion and frustration. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. This woman was not only trespassing, but it also seemed like she had been planning something for a while. I had no idea how she managed to get a hold of these papers or what she was really up to, but I knew I had to get to the bottom of it. After a few tense moments, the officer glanced up from the papers and looked at me. "Can you tell me again what happened when you left for your trip?" he asked, his voice calm but serious. I nodded, still trying to process everything. "I left a few days ago for a business trip. I never told anyone to rent out my house, and I didn't authorize any agreement with the HOA. I came home today and found her here, acting like she has every right to be in my house. She says the HOA arranged it, but I've never heard of anything like that." The officer nodded, taking notes as I spoke. "And you've never rented the house out to anyone?" "Never," I replied firmly. "This is my home. I've never leased it to anyone, not through the HOA or anyone else." The woman stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She had a look of annoyance on her face, but she didn't say anything. It seemed like she was trying to maintain control of the situation, but I could see her growing more impatient as the minutes ticked by. The officer turned back to her, holding up the papers she had given him. "These documents don't look right," he said, his tone sharp. "They seem a little off. We're going to need to verify this with the HOA." The woman's face tightened and she stepped forward. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising. "I'm just staying here temporarily. The HOA told me everything was arranged. This is my legal right." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Her story was starting to fall apart, and she was getting more defensive as the officers questioned her. She had no answers, and it was clear she wasn't expecting this kind of pushback. The officer didn't seem to be buying her story, and I could feel a small sense of relief creeping in. At least I wasn't the only one who thought something was wrong. The other officer, who had been silently observing, finally spoke up. "We're going to make a call to the HOA, ma'am. Please stay where you are." The woman's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms again and glaring at both of us. She didn't say anything more, but I could tell she was starting to realize that her plans might be unraveling. I took a deep breath, my body still tense from the whole situation, but for the first time since I walked through that door, I felt like things were finally starting to go in my favor. The officer stepped aside and made the call. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity, but then I heard him speak into the receiver. "Yes, this is Officer Reynolds with the city police. We're here at my address, and we have a situation involving a woman who claims to be renting the property through the HOA. Can you verify this?" There was a long pause as the officer listened carefully, nodding as he took down notes. My heart was pounding as I waited for the response. I was praying that this call would confirm everything I suspected, that this woman was a fraud. The officer hung up the phone a moment later, his expression grim. "The HOA has no record of any rental agreement for this property," he said, looking directly at the woman. "They've never authorized any such arrangement. It looks like you've been living here under false pretenses." The woman's face went pale. She took a small step back, clearly caught off guard by the news. For the first time, she seemed genuinely worried. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered them from her chest. "That's not possible," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "The papers, they said—" "The papers were forged," the officer interrupted, his voice firm. "It's a crime to make false claims like this. You've been trespassing on this property and providing fake documents to the police. You're going to have to come with us." The woman's eyes darted around the room, and for a brief moment I thought she might try to flee. But she stayed put, her shoulders slumping in defeat. The reality of the situation was sinking in for her, and it was clear she didn't have a way out. She had been living in my home for 2 weeks, and now everything was falling apart. The officer took a step forward, placing a hand on her arm gently but firmly. "You're under arrest for trespassing and fraud. I'm going to have to place you in custody." The woman didn't resist. She just stood there, her face flushed with embarrassment, and let the officer guide her out of the living room. The second officer followed them out, closing the door behind them. I stood there for a moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. The weight of the past few hours was beginning to hit me. My house, my sanctuary, had been invaded, and I had been powerless to stop it until now. I had no idea how she had managed to get into my home or how she had tricked the HOA into believing she had the right to be there, but I was grateful that the truth had finally come to light. The officers returned shortly after, letting me know that they had taken the woman into custody. "She'll be taken to the station and will be conducting further investigations," Officer Reynolds explained. "We'll need you to file a formal report as well." I nodded, still in a daze. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I appreciate your help." As the officers left, I closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a moment. My mind was spinning, but one thing was clear: I wasn't going to let anyone take my home from me again. The feeling of relief washed over me as I finally realized that the nightmare was over, at least for now. But as I looked around the living room, I couldn't help but wonder how this woman had gotten so far. She had been living in my home for 2 weeks, and I still had so many unanswered questions. How had she managed to get the documents? Who else was involved in this scheme? And more importantly, why had the HOA allowed something like this to happen? There was still so much to uncover, but for now, I was just grateful that I could finally take back control of my home. The house was silent after the officers left, and I found myself standing in the middle of the living room, trying to process everything that had just happened. It was hard to believe that the woman who had been sitting casually on the couch for the last few hours had been living in my home for the past 2 weeks without my knowledge or permission. Even though the officers had taken her into custody, I still couldn't wrap my head around how she had managed to get this far. I walked through the house slowly, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The once peaceful and familiar space now felt different, almost foreign. Everywhere I looked, I saw signs of someone else's presence. A glass of water left on the coffee table, a jacket hanging on the back of a chair. Little things that made it clear that someone had been living here, making themselves comfortable, as if they owned the place. As I walked through the house, I couldn't stop thinking about how this had all happened. How could the HOA have allowed something like this to go on for 2 weeks without me knowing? I had been a good member of the community, always following the rules, always keeping my house in good condition. The idea that the HOA could have been so careless with something as important as my home felt like a betrayal. I sat down on the couch, still trying to piece everything together. The woman's story didn't add up, and I knew I had to get to the bottom of it. How had she managed to forge documents and convince the HOA that she had the right to stay in my house? And why hadn't anyone questioned her sooner? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that there had to be more to this than just one woman trying to get free housing. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the HOA office. I was determined to get answers, even if it meant pushing them to the limit. After a few rings, a receptionist answered the phone. "Good afternoon, this is the HOA office. How can I help you?" "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I need to speak with someone about a situation involving my property. There's been a mix-up, and I need to understand what happened." "Certainly," the receptionist replied. "Can you provide your name and address, please?" I gave her the details, and she quickly checked her records. "I see your name here," she said. "What seems to be the issue?" "There's a woman who's been living in my house for 2 weeks," I said, my frustration building. "She claims that the HOA arranged for her to stay there. I never gave permission for anyone to stay in my home, and I've never authorized any rental agreement. I need to know how this could have happened." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the receptionist typing something into her computer. "I'm not sure I understand," she said. "Let me check with our records department. I'll get back to you in just a moment." I waited, tapping my foot nervously as I listened to the soft hum of hold music. Every second felt like an eternity. I couldn't help but replay the events of the past few hours in my mind, trying to make sense of everything. How could the HOA have allowed this to happen? How could they have let a stranger stay in my home without any oversight? I had always trusted the HOA to take care of these things, but now I was beginning to question their competence. Finally, the receptionist came back on the line. "Thank you for your patience," she said. "I've spoken with our records department, and I'm afraid there seems to have been a mistake. We don't have any record of a rental agreement for your property. However, there is a note in the system about a temporary stay, but it doesn't seem to be officially documented. I'm going to need to check with the person who handled that request. Please hold for a moment." I felt my blood pressure rise as I listened to her speak. A temporary stay? That didn't make any sense. No one had contacted me about any such request, and the woman who had been staying in my house had made it clear that she had been told everything was arranged by the HOA. The more I heard, the more it sounded like there had been some kind of mistake, but it was a mistake that shouldn't have happened in the first place. I clenched my jaw and tried to stay calm as the minutes passed. Every moment felt like an eternity. I didn't want to accuse anyone of being negligent, but it was hard not to feel like I had been let down by the very people who were supposed to be protecting my interests. The thought of a stranger living in my house, taking over my space, was unsettling enough. But the fact that the HOA had been involved, even indirectly, made it feel like a much bigger betrayal. After what felt like forever, the receptionist came back on the line. "I've spoken with the person who handled the request," she said. "It seems there was some confusion. Someone from our office mistakenly assumed that the property owner had approved the stay. They didn't have all the necessary documentation, and there was no official agreement in place. I'm terribly sorry for the mix-up." I took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. "So this woman was allowed to stay in my house based on some assumption? No one checked with me first?" "Yes," the receptionist admitted. "There seems to have been a communication breakdown. I can assure you this was not intentional, but it was a mistake on our part. We'll take full responsibility for the situation." I felt a wave of anger wash over me. "This mistake," I said, my voice tight with frustration, "has caused a lot of stress, and I want to know what the HOA is going to do about it. How are you going to fix this?" "We're going to do everything we can to make things right," the receptionist replied quickly. "We will be looking into how this happened, and we'll be reviewing our procedures to ensure this never happens again. I'll have someone from our team reach out to you directly to discuss compensation for the inconvenience caused. We are very sorry for the trouble." I let out a deep sigh, my shoulders tense as I processed the conversation. It was clear that the HOA was taking responsibility for their part in the mistake, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. I had trusted them to manage the community and protect my property, and now I felt like I had been left in the dark. "I appreciate you taking the time to explain this to me," I said, my voice a little calmer now. "But I want to make sure this situation is resolved properly. I'll be expecting a call from someone in your office soon." "Of course," the receptionist replied. "We'll be in touch." I hung up the phone, still feeling a mix of relief and frustration. The situation was far from over, but at least I had some answers now. The woman who had been living in my house was a stranger to the HOA, and they had made a mistake. It wasn't much, but it was a start. But as I sat there in the silence of my home, I couldn't help but wonder, how many more mistakes like this had the HOA made? And how much longer would I have to keep dealing with the consequences of their negligence? It had been a few hours since the phone call with the HOA office, and although I was grateful for the answers they had provided, I was far from satisfied. The more I thought about the situation, the more I realized how careless and sloppy everything had been. The woman who had been living in my house for 2 weeks was still fresh in my mind, and now that she was in custody, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to her story than she had let on. The officers had taken her away for questioning, but I had no idea what was happening on their end. What if this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding? What if there was something more sinister at play here? I couldn't help but wonder who else might be involved in the situation. This wasn't just about one woman breaking into my house. There had to be more behind it. I couldn't stay still any longer, so I decided to make myself a cup of tea and sit down to think. The sound of the kettle boiling was the only thing that broke the silence in the house. As I waited for the water to heat up, I glanced around the living room again, seeing the subtle reminders of the woman's presence. The glass on the table, the jacket thrown carelessly on the armchair. All of these things seemed like small details, but they were a constant reminder that my privacy had been violated. The kettle whistled, snapping me back to reality. I poured the hot water over the tea bag and sat down at the kitchen table. My mind was racing as I tried to piece everything together. How had this woman managed to stay in my house for 2 weeks without my knowledge? It was clear she had planned this carefully. She wasn't just some random intruder. She had made it seem like she had a legitimate reason to be here. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how vulnerable I had been. I hadn't even noticed that someone had been living in my home. It was unsettling. My phone buzzed on the table, breaking my thoughts. I picked it up and saw that it was a message from the HOA office. They had finally responded to my earlier inquiry, and the message read, "Dear Your Name, thank you for your patience. We have completed a thorough review of the situation. It appears that the woman who was staying in your property, name, had forged several documents and used them to manipulate our office. She convinced a staff member that she had your approval to stay there. Unfortunately, there was a significant lapse in our internal procedures that allowed this to happen. We deeply apologize for the confusion and the stress this has caused. Our team is taking immediate action to address the situation, including reviewing our processes and ensuring that something like this never happens again. In the meantime, we will be in touch with you regarding the next steps and how we plan to compensate you for the inconvenience. We will also make sure to cooperate fully with the authorities in the investigation. Sincerely." I stared at the message for a moment, feeling a mix of relief and anger. At least now I had concrete information. The woman had forged documents and manipulated the HOA staff into believing she had a legitimate reason to stay in my house. But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. How could the HOA office have been so easily duped? What was the staff member who had allowed this to happen thinking? I knew I had to get to the bottom of this. The truth was finally coming to light, but I still had so many questions. How had she gotten the forged documents? Who had helped her? Was she working alone, or was there a larger operation behind this? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just an isolated incident. There was something bigger going on here, and I was determined to find out what it was. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. I quickly picked it up, hoping for some kind of update. "Hello," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hello, Your Name, this is Officer Reynolds. I'm calling to update you on the situation regarding the woman who was staying in your home." I sat up straighter, my heart racing. "Yes, what's the latest?" "We've made some significant progress. Officer Reynolds said. After questioning her further, we've learned that she wasn't acting alone. It turns out that she was part of a larger scheme involving several individuals who have been using similar tactics to gain access to vacant homes in the area. My stomach dropped. This was worse than I had imagined. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman you encountered was part of a group that's been targeting homes in the community, Officer Reynolds explained. They've been forging documents, convincing homeowners associations that they have the owner's permission to stay in these properties. They've been using the same tactic in several neighborhoods, and it looks like you were just one of their victims. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. A group. This was no longer just a random break-in. This was a carefully orchestrated scheme, and I had been caught in the middle of it. My house wasn't the only one they'd targeted. There were likely other victims out there, and I had no idea how many people had been affected by this group's actions. This is insane, I said, my voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and anger. How long has this been going on? It's hard to say at this point, Officer Reynolds replied. We're still investigating, but we believe it's been happening for several months. The group has been using various methods to create fake rental agreements, and they've managed to bypass HOA offices by exploiting weaknesses in their systems. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the information. This was a full-blown operation, and it had been going on right under everyone's noses. The HOA's system had been compromised, and I was just one of the many people who had been taken advantage of. We'll be working with the HOA to identify how this was allowed to happen, Officer Reynolds continued. In the meantime, we'll be taking further steps to track down the other members of the group. We'll also be looking into any other properties that may have been affected. I nodded even though I knew he couldn't see me. Thank you for letting me know. Please keep me updated. Of course, he said. We're doing everything we can to resolve this. We'll be in touch soon with more information. The call ended, and I sat there for a few moments, trying to process everything I had just learned. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how deeply this situation had shaken me. It wasn't just about a woman staying in my house without my permission. It was about a group of people exploiting a system and taking advantage of homeowners like me. It was about trust being violated on a much larger scale. I knew the investigation wasn't over, and I had a lot more questions to ask. But at least now, the truth was starting to emerge. The woman who had been living in my house was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle, and I was determined to see it through to the end. It had been a few days since I had last spoken with Officer Reynolds, and although I was grateful for the updates, I couldn't help but feel like the situation was far from over. The woman who had been living in my home for 2 weeks had been arrested, but there was still so much I didn't know. The police were investigating a larger operation involving multiple homes in the neighborhood, and it was clear that this wasn't just a simple case of one person sneaking into my house. It was part of a much bigger scheme, and I felt a strange mix of relief and anger as I thought about everything that had happened. The HOA had promised to look into the issue and tighten up their processes to make sure something like this didn't happen again. But honestly, I wasn't sure I could trust them. They had allowed this woman to get so far without even questioning her. And now, as I sat in my living room, still reeling from everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. The police had taken the woman away for questioning, but they hadn't revealed much more about the other people involved in the scheme. Officer Reynolds had told me that they were working on tracking down the rest of the group, but there had been no updates. The longer I waited, the more I began to feel like the investigation was moving too slowly. I wanted answers, and I wanted them now. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and emails. The HOA had been in touch, offering their apologies and promising that they would make things right. They said they would reimburse me for any losses and would cover the cost of the damages to my property. But that didn't make me feel any better. The damage wasn't just about the physical things in my house. It was about my trust in the system being shattered. I had trusted the HOA to protect my home, and they had failed. It was hard to feel completely relieved. The woman was gone, but her presence still lingered in the house. Every time I looked at the couch where she had sat or at the glass she had left behind, I couldn't help but feel a sense of violation. I had always thought of my home as a place of peace and safety, but now it felt like I was constantly on edge. waiting for something else to go wrong. I spent the next few days cleaning up, putting things back in order and trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy. But it wasn't easy. The sense of intrusion didn't fade overnight. I kept wondering who else might have been affected by this scheme. Was I the only one? Were there other people in the neighborhood who had been tricked the same way I had? One afternoon, I received a call from Officer Reynolds. My heart skipped a beat as I answered. Hello? Hi, your name, it's Officer Reynolds. I wanted to update you on the investigation, he said, his voice calm but serious. Thank you for calling, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. What's the latest? We've been able to track down a few more individuals involved in the scheme, Officer Reynolds replied. We've made some arrests and we're piecing together how they were operating. It seems that this group has been using a variety of tactics to gain access to vacant homes, not just through forged documents, but also by exploiting weaknesses in the HOA's systems. We're still working on identifying the full extent of their operation. I felt a small sense of relief hearing this. At least the police were making progress, but it wasn't enough. I wanted to know how deep this went, how many other people had been affected. The idea that there might be others out there, living with the same uncertainty I had experienced, made me feel sick. We're still investigating the full scope of the group's activities, Officer Reynolds continued. But we've been able to confirm that several other homes have been targeted. We're working with the HOA to ensure that these incidents don't happen again. We'll also be taking further legal action against those involved. Thank you, I said, my voice tight with frustration. But I still don't understand how this happened. How could the HOA have let this go on for so long without noticing? I thought they were supposed to protect homeowners. We understand your frustration, Officer Reynolds said. The HOA did drop the ball on this one, and we're making sure they take responsibility. We're also working with them to make sure their procedures are tightened up moving forward. We don't want this to happen to anyone else. I was still angry, but hearing that the police were taking this seriously gave me some comfort. At least they were holding the HOA accountable. I appreciate you keeping me updated, I said, trying to stay calm. Please keep me informed if anything new comes up. I will, Officer Reynolds promised. We're doing everything we can to resolve this. As I hung up the phone, I felt a small sense of relief. The investigation was moving forward, and it seemed like the people responsible for the scheme were being caught. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that I had been let down by the very people who were supposed to help protect me. The HOA had failed me, and it wasn't something I could just forget. In the following weeks, I received regular updates from both the HOA and the police. The HOA had implemented new policies to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future, and they had agreed to reimburse me for the inconvenience caused. They also promised to be more transparent about any future arrangements involving my property. But while the financial compensation was appreciated, it didn't solve the bigger problem. My trust in the system had been shattered. The idea that someone could just walk into my home, pretending to have permission, was a feeling I couldn't shake. I realized that this wasn't just about one woman or one group. It was about a larger issue of accountability and transparency within organizations meant to serve and protect homeowners. I started to take a more active role in ensuring my home was protected. I changed the locks on all my doors, installed a security system, and made sure to double-check any future communications from the HOA. I also began researching more about homeowners' rights and how I could better protect myself in the future. The experience had changed me. I was more cautious now, more aware of how easily things could go wrong. But I also felt stronger, knowing that I had taken control of the situation and made sure I was heard. The woman who had taken over my house was gone, but the lessons I had learned stayed with me. As time passed, the memories of those chaotic days began to fade, but the experience remained a reminder of how fragile our sense of security can be. I had learned that trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild, but it's not impossible. With time, patience, and a little bit of effort, I could make my home feel safe again. And that was exactly what I was going to do.